Have you ever like had one of those conversations where, it just feels like you're speaking different languages, like you're trying to get your point across, but the other person just doesn't seem to be getting it, like talking to a brick wall?
Definitely.
Yeah, me too. It's so frustrating. It really got me thinking about how we communicate, you know, and whether there's like a better way, a way that helps us actually
Gotcha.
like understand each other and avoid those frustrating miscommunications. Well, so I recently dove into this book, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life by Marshall Rosenberg. And it's honestly given me a whole new perspective on communication. It's really all about like compassionate communication, both with ourselves and with others. Now, before you think this is all about, just being nice and letting people walk all over you, let me tell you, it's not. It's about expressing ourselves honestly, but without blame and hearing others without judgment. It's about connecting like on a deeper level and finding solutions that actually work for everyone involved. One of the first things that really hit me in the book was this idea of separating observations from evaluations. So like instead of saying you're always late, which is, an evaluation, you could say something like you arrived at 8:30 and we agreed to meet at 8:00. So that's an observation. Just stating the facts without judgment sounds pretty simple, right? But it can really de-escalate a situation. And it can open up space for better understanding. I mean, think about it. How many times have you been on the receiving end of like a judgment? How did it make you feel? Defensive, angry, not really likely to actually listen, right? But when someone just states what they observed without like adding their own opinions, it's so much easier to hear them and maybe even see their point of view. Then there's this whole thing about like feelings and needs, which is really central to nonviolent communication, or NVC for short. Rosenberg says that all human behavior is an attempt to meet needs. And when our needs aren't met, we tend to experience feelings like anger, sadness, frustration, and so on. So instead of blaming others for how we feel, NVC encourages us to like identify our own needs and then express them clearly and respectfully. This was kind of an aha moment for me because, let's be honest. How often do we actually blame others for our feelings? Like,
Yeah.
you made me angry.
Mhm.
But the truth is, no one can make us feel anything. Our feelings actually come from our own needs, and you know whether or not those needs are being met. One of the examples in the book that really stuck with me was about this volunteer at a hospital. She was asked to talk to an elderly patient who kept saying, I want to die, I want to die, over and over. And the nurses tried like everything to kind of cheer her up. They told her she wasn't that sick and that she would get better if she just took her medicine. But nothing seemed to work. So this volunteer comes in, and instead of trying to like fix the situation, she simply acknowledges the patient's feelings. She sits down and says, so you would like to die. Haha. And guess what? The woman just stops chanting and starts talking about how terrible she feels. The volunteer just listens empathetically. And before long, they're sitting there with their arms around each other. Later that day, the nurses were just amazed. They're like, what did she do? She's eating, taking her medicine, and like in much better spirits.
That's powerful, right?
Like sometimes all people need is to be truly heard, to have someone just acknowledge their feelings without judgment. Kind of reminds me of that saying, sometimes all you need is a listening ear.
Right.
But it goes deeper than that, right? It's about really trying to understand the other person's perspective, even if we don't necessarily agree with it. And that brings us to another like key concept in NVC, the difference between requests and demands. So when we make demands, it kind of creates resistance, right? It implies that the other person just has to do what we want or else. But when we make requests, we're acknowledging that the other person actually has a choice. It's like saying, this is what I would like, but, I respect your autonomy.
Yeah.
And that can honestly make a huge difference in how our message is received. So, for example, instead of saying you need to clean your room right now, which, sounds like a demand, you could try saying something like, hey, would you be willing to tidy up your room sometime today? It would really help me feel less stressed. So you're expressing your need, but you're not forcing the other person to comply. You're giving them a choice.
This whole idea of requests versus demands has really made me think about how I communicate with everyone, really, especially my kids. You know how it is? It's so easy to slip into like parent mode and start barking orders. But when I remember to phrase things as requests and explain like why it matters to me, I actually get much less resistance. And I think even more importantly, it helps my kids feel like respected and understood. Now I know what you're thinking. This all sounds great in theory, but how do I actually like put this into practice? And you're right. It's not always easy. It takes practice and it definitely takes patience. But I've been trying to incorporate these principles into my own life. And I'm finding that, when I actually make the effort, my relationships are so much richer and more fulfilling. And that's what's so exciting about NVC. It's not just about avoiding conflict, it's about creating deeper connections and building more satisfying relationships. It's about understanding ourselves and others on a much deeper level. And honestly, who wouldn't want that? Another thing that really resonated with me in the book was this poem by Ruth Bebermeyer.
It talks about how we often like label people and how those labels can really limit our understanding of them. It goes like this. Before you call me crazy, think, was he a lazy man or did he just do things we label lazy? I've never seen a stupid kid. I've seen a kid who sometimes did things I didn't understand or things in ways I hadn't planned. I've seen a kid who hadn't seen the same places where I had been, but he was not a stupid kid. Before you call him stupid, think, was he a stupid kid or did he just know different things than you did? Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? We all have our own biases and judgments, right? And it's so easy to project those onto others without even realizing it. Like maybe someone cuts us off in traffic and instantly we label them as a jerk, right? But what if they were rushing to the hospital? What if they were just having a really bad day? You know, NVC challenges us to kind of step back and really see people for who they are, to understand their needs and feelings, and to communicate with them in a way that's both honest and compassionate. It's about recognizing that, everyone is doing the best they can with the resources they have, even if their best doesn't look like our best. And speaking of doing our best, the book also has some really great insights on how to deal with those like really tough conversations, the ones where it feels like you're talking to a brick wall. You know what I mean? There's this technique called reflective listening, which is basically just repeating back what the other person has said to make sure you like understand them correctly. And it might feel a little awkward at 1st, but it can be really helpful because it shows the other person that you're truly listening and that you're trying to see things from their perspective. I tried this recently with a friend who's venting about a work situation. And instead of jumping in with advice or trying to, fix things, I just listened and reflected back what I heard her saying. Like, it sounds like you're feeling really undervalued and frustrated right now. So, you know what? Just being heard, having her feelings acknowledged seemed to help her calm down and start thinking more clearly about the situation. Sometimes that's all it takes, right? Just to feel like someone gets it. And NVC isn't just about like how we communicate with others. It's also about how we communicate with ourselves. It's about understanding our own needs, our own feelings, and being able to express them in a way that's both honest and, compassionate. The book actually talks about how to transform those self-judgments into more compassionate self-talk. Like instead of saying, I'm so stupid, you could say, I'm feeling disappointed in myself because I made a mistake and I'd like to learn from it. It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a friend. I've been trying this out myself. And it's really amazing how much of a difference it makes. It's so easy to beat ourselves up when we mess up. But when we can shift to a more compassionate perspective, it really frees us from that cycle of self-blame and shame. One of the most profound things I've learned from NVC is that it's not just a communication technique. It's more like a way of life. It's about choosing empathy over judgment, connection over separation. And it's contagious. When we start to communicate nonviolently, it inspires others to do the same. It's like throwing a pebble into a pond, creating ripples that spread outward. So if you're looking for a way to improve your relationships, to communicate more effectively, or just to live a more fulfilling life, I highly recommend checking out Nonviolent Communication, Language of Life. It's such a powerful tool for personal and social transformation. And who knows, maybe, just maybe, if enough of us embrace this way of being, we can create a world where peace and understanding are the norm rather than the exception. It might sound idealistic, but I truly believe that change starts with each one of us. It starts with being mindful of our language, with choosing compassion over judgment, with listening to understand rather than to respond. It starts with recognizing that we're all interconnected, that we all have needs, and that we all want to be happy. And when we start to live from that place of understanding and compassion, well, that's when the real magic happens. It's funny, when I first started learning about NVC, I thought it was mostly about like resolving conflicts and, smoothing things over in like difficult situations. And it definitely is helpful for that, right? But, as I've been diving deeper into it, I'm realizing it's so much more than that. It's really about shifting our whole way of being in the world. You know what I mean? It's about cultivating this mindset of compassion and understanding, not just in like specific moments, but as like a foundation for how we actually interact with everyone and everything around us. There's this one passage in the book that really struck me. It says, it is our nature to enjoy giving and receiving compassionately. We have, however, learned many forms of life-alienating communication that lead us to speak and behave in ways that injure others and ourselves. And it's so true, isn't it? It's like we've learned all these different ways of communicating that create distance and disconnection, that lead to conflict and misunderstanding. But the good news is we can unlearn those habits.
Right.
We can choose like a different path. We can choose to communicate in a way that nourishes connection, that fosters understanding, that celebrates our shared humanity. And NBC gives us the tools to do that. It helps us to identify our needs, to express them clearly and respectfully, and to really hear the needs of others, even when they're expressed in ways that are, less than skillful. One of the things I've been working on lately is being more mindful of the language I use, both to myself and to others. Like instead of saying things like, I should have done this or you shouldn't have done that, which is all about judgment and blame, right? I'm trying to focus on expressing my feelings and needs more directly. So for example, instead of saying, you should have called me back, I might say something like, I was feeling hurt and disappointed because I was hoping to hear from you. It's amazing how much of a difference that simple shift can make, both in how I feel and in how the other person responds. Because when we can express our needs without blame or judgment, it invites the other person to connect with us on a much deeper level. It creates space for understanding and empathy. And that's where the real magic of NVC happens, in those moments of genuine connection. And it's not just about communicating with others, it's also about communicating with ourselves, right? It's about cultivating that same sense of compassion and understanding towards our own thoughts and feelings. It's about recognizing that we're human, that we make mistakes, that we have needs, and that it's okay to feel all of those things. So the next time you find yourself beating yourself up over something, try shifting to a more NVC-based approach. Instead of saying, I'm such an idiot, why did I do that? Try ask yourself, what was I needing in that moment? What feelings were coming up for me? And then just offer yourself some compassion. Talk to yourself the way you would talk to a good friend who's going through a tough time. It might feel a little awkward at first, but I promise it gets easier with practice. And the more you do it, the more natural it will become to approach yourself and everyone else with kindness and understanding. So what does this all mean for you? Well, I encourage you to take what you've learned from this deep dive and start experimenting with it in your own life. Notice how you communicate with yourself and with others. See if you can identify those moments where you're slipping into judgment or blame or demands. And then just gently try shifting to a more NVC-based approach. It might not always be easy, but I promise it's worth the effort. Because when we can learn to communicate with compassion and understanding, we open ourselves up to a world of possibilities. We create a space for deeper connections, more fulfilling relationships, and ultimately a more peaceful and joyful existence. And that, my friends, is something worth striving for.